with neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to rewire itself, and neurogenesis, the ability to create new neurons, there's hope really for everyone. Now, the more hardwired or the more ingrained the habit or addiction is, the harder it is to change. But I outline various steps in the book to help prevent the most damaging behaviors or the most unhealthy behaviors. And those who are already in trouble are probably going to need more intense interventions. And we're starting to see specialized clinics emerge that can help people with particular addictions and maladaptive behaviors around the use of smartphone and other technologies. Well, the time it takes to undo unhealthy habits and generate healthy habits really depends on the individual and what the behaviors are. So, for example, we know that people, young males, are showing up in urologist's office with a new problem that didn't exist in young males previously, which is erectile dysfunction. And I talk about this in the book as an example of how the brain is being rewired so much because young teen boys are being introduced to sex through online pornography. And then when they're with a real woman, they're unable to get an erection and perform. It typically takes about a year for those young men to stop doing the online pornography and regain normal sexual functions. There are cases that it could take up to 2 years. So that's just one example of how long these things can take when the maladaptive behavior or the unhealthy behavior is ingrained. Well, for a long time, we thought that addictions of all forms, whether it was substance use or alcohol or gambling, were failures of character or willpower. We now know that these are really failures of the brain and that an awful lot of variables come together to create addiction. That includes genetic susceptibility, the environment you grew up with, the learning you had, the exposures you have and quite frankly, and most importantly, how healthy is a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex and its ability to guide neuroplasticity and make change. And so we need to recognize that this isn't about character or willpower. It's really a brain disorder that people need to be supported in, and that we all need to be aware to some degree we're all at risk. Well, I think understanding the neuroscience gives us a framework for understanding the problem and a framework for understanding the best interventions. So, for example, when you look at, say, children between the ages of 3 and 5, when they're starting to really accelerate their learning how to read and their ability to read more and more complex text, we know from research studies that children who are exposed to a lot of media during that period or before that period don't form the same neural networks around reading that children who aren't exposed to a lot of media do. And we also know that the ability to read is a complex skill neurobiologically and requires considered practice and an awful lot of repetition. So, understanding the impact of media consumption on the developing mind at a critical stage where learning to read really sets people up for future success, I think helps us understand how and why the recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics and others are to really limit exposure to any and all media to less than 1 hour a day during that time. So, when we're thinking about the development of the prefrontal cortex, first we have to understand that it is the most interconnected region of the brain. It is the last part to fully mature, meaning typically in the third decade of life, which means the vulnerable period for the prefrontal cortex is really birth to the mid 20s. A fully formed prefrontal cortex takes up about a third of our gray matter and one third of our calories consumed. It directs attention, emotion regulation, memory, and storage. And I like to say that a healthy prefrontal cortex is the difference between focus and inattention, insight and impulse, habit and addiction, and ultimately reaction and reflection. So it's very important at all stages of development. Well, it can manifest itself in different ways. One of the maybe most familiar is through attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. So we know that ADHD is a failure of the prefrontal cortex to filter out distracting stimuli and allow children at different ages to focus on the task at hand. And we have medications and therapy that can help do that. What people are probably less familiar with is the fact that depression, for example, is also the failure of the prefrontal cortex to help regulate the emotion centers and reward centers of the brain. So that circuitry actually gets knocked off. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that we can begin to understand the increase in rates of anxiety and depression among teenagers over the last 2 decades as a function of media and technology use surrounded with portable and mobile digital devices. So I think it's really important that we begin to take seriously the impact these technologies can have on the developing brain. Well, first we have to understand that the reward system is a key part of human existence, right? We wouldn't go after and seek out things without it being rewarding. I like to say, as complex as the brain is, we can really take every reaction to every stimulus in the world and put it into one of three buckets. Is this something I want more of and I go towards it? Is this something I don't want and I move away from it? Or the most common, believe it or not, is it's not relevant. I'm going to ignore it. We ignore the vast majority of stimuli in our environment. And so once we understand that, then we need to understand that that system, the approach, avoid, ignore, can be hijacked in various ways. And one of the challenges we have around social media and other applications is that the companies that are building them really have one goal in mind, which is to capture your attention as long as possible so they can sell advertising and make money. And so when we realize that, they're going to be going after any hack that they can get to get that reward center to fire to bring those young eyeballs back over and over and over. Yeah, it's a good question. So we know that certain substances, alcohol, cocaine, certain opiates, in some people will trigger an exaggerated reward response. The example I give in the book is chocolate. So imagine you've never had chocolate before and you come to see me and I say, "Hey, do you want to try this chocolate?" And you look at it and you take a bite of it and you like it and you enjoy it and your reward centers fire pretty significantly. The next time you come and see me, your reward centers actually fire in anticipation of eating that chocolate, not after you eat it. So what the reward system does is it primes the brain to seek out a past behavior over and over and over again. And that's where it becomes insidious. And we know that certain drugs can stimulate dopamine releases on the order of 10, 100, 1,000 fold higher than, say, looking at a sunset or enjoying a nice story or a cup of tea. So we have to realize that some of these reinforcers are very, very powerful. And being able to understand which ones are super powerful and which ones are less so, I think is where we need to begin to educate young people sooner rather than later.